Okay, in this video we'll be focusing on writing effective introductions. Now if you've been taught about introductions before, especially in high school, you've probably been taught something similar to the triangle method, right? This is when you start with some broad, generic opening sentence and then slowly narrow your paragraph until you arrive at your thesis statement down here. Now, there are a couple of problems with this model that I see. For one, it can be really tricky to pull off. When I was taught this in high school, I always felt like I was trying to dock the space shuttle or something, that I was trying to guide this large thing towards a vague target, this thesis statement that I was supposed to have in mind. But I think even the bigger problem with this is that it doesn't explain to your audience why your essay matters, why what you have to say is important in the first place. And this is a crucial step for any introduction, okay? So what I propose instead of this triangle model is a three-step model, all right? The first step is establishing a baseline. Second, pivoting. And then third, providing a solution to the problem presented, okay? I think this does a much better job of explaining to the audience why what you have to say is significant and why they should pay attention. All right, let's start with the first step, establish a baseline. What that means is to just start from a familiar, stable position or situation, something that will come very naturally to your audience. This is the once upon a time scenario, of fairy tales where everything seems pretty safe and secure. You might, for instance, consider how I started this video. I started by referencing something that was probably very familiar to most of you, the triangle method, to hopefully kind of start from a place that you are already comfortable with. The next step is the pivot, and the pivot is when you disrupt that baseline by introducing a problem or a misunderstanding to that familiar common situation that you have introduced, all right? Now, the pivot can often be very easy to identify because it is often begun with a set of signal terms that are very easy to point out. Something like but, or however, or yet, or unfortunately, anything that indicates a point of contrast where we're moving from a baseline to some type of problem, okay? Again, if I go back to my original introduction, my baseline was the triangle method that you learned in high school, and then I pivoted from that by introducing what I see are the problems with that triangle method. That is, it's difficult to pull off and it doesn't establish any purpose to your essay. This leads us to the final step, which is providing a solution. This is when you introduce your thesis statement. And the thesis statement should naturally kind of resolve the problem or misunderstanding that was introduced in the pivot, right? And it'll feel very natural. I mean, if I had begun this video and said, look, you've learned about the triangle method, here are some problems with it, good luck with that. You'd be right to think, well, this is pretty lame. What's the point of telling us what's wrong if you don't try to address that problem in any way? So instead, what I did is after establishing a baseline, pivoting from that by introducing some problems, disrupting that baseline, I offered a solution, which is this three-step model. Now, this method is not some newfangled thing or something that just applies to academic essays. In fact, I think once you grasp the steps of this model, you'll start to see it all over the place, right? Let's take some examples, all right? Today is Thursday, December 22nd. We're at the New York Times website. Let's check out their opinion page, look at some of their articles and see, can we identify this three-step process? Can we see how they establish a baseline, pivot from it, and then provide a solution to their problems? Let's look at this article. To slow global warming, we need nuclear power. Now, what I want you to do is just read this first paragraph here and take some time to see if you can identify where they establish a baseline, how they pivot from that baseline, and how they provide a solution. Okay, let's see how we did. Now, our first question is going to be, how do they establish a baseline? So let's look at that first sentence. If 20 fire marshals came around and told us our houses were about to burn down, we'd buy some fire insurance. Notice how they take a hypothetical scenario that their audience is most likely to agree with and put that at the beginning. So They established that the expertise of fire marshals is something that we care about, right? Okay, so then how do they pivot? Let's turn to the next sentence. So when the leading science academies in 20 developed countries, along with several major American corporations and the national security community, all tell us that burning fossil fuels is causing dangerous changes to the climate, we think it's time for the United States to get serious about clean energy. So you see what they did there? They established the baseline of we tend to agree with experts, and then they pivot from that by saying, so why don't we agree with the experts on climate change? Okay? They disrupt that baseline by pointing out our inconsistency. Now, what about the thesis? How do they provide a solution? Last sentence. It also means supporting safely operating nuclear power plants that produce carbon-free electricity. Boom, there it is. Now we've moved from a baseline, introduced a problem, and we have our thesis, which is nuclear power is important for a carbon-free economy and power grid. Okay, let's look at a different example. Let's go back to the opinion page. Pick another article to look at. This one on Super Mario Run looks to be pretty interesting. Super Mario Run's not so super gender politics. Sounds like a hot take. All right, I'm going to pause the video again and give you the chance to look at these first couple of paragraphs. And again, I want you to try to identify how do they establish a baseline, how do they pivot from that baseline, and finally, how do they introduce their thesis or solution. Okay, let's see how you did. Now, hopefully when you read this first paragraph, you notice that they are establishing the context and the information about the current situation at hand. That Super Mario Run has been released, that it's been enormously popular, that it's now on the iPhone. They even have a really cool statistic to help make their point. It's been downloaded 37 million times in its first 3 days. Okay, this is a great example of establishing the baseline by showing something that's familiar and easily relatable. Okay, now how do they pivot from that? If you notice in the second paragraph, they begin with one of these key signal terms. Unfortunately, that indicates to the audience they are about to contrast what came before with their new sentence. All right. Unfortunately, despite Nintendo's history and reputation, Super Mario Run is not a family-friendly game. So they've introduced a problem. There is something not good about this game that we want to bring attention to. And then how do they go from their pivot to their solution, to their thesis? This comes in the next sentence. The game is rife with stale, retrograde gender stereotypes. And then we can presume that the rest of the article is going to explain how they use these gender stereotypes and why that is, in fact, such a problem. Okay? But the key is, in just a couple of paragraphs, they've established a baseline. Super Mario Run, very popular, a new important thing going on. They've pivoted from that current situation to raise some sort of problem. It's not a family-friendly game. And then they've transitioned into their solution or explanation of that problem, which is that it traffics in stale, retrograde gender stereotypes. So again, start with the baseline, pivot from that, move into the solution.